I was 17 when I first heard it. Be my priest. It had been a physically and psychologically draining weekend, packed into a church social hall with about 50 other high school kids. Little sleep, powerful testimony from peers and respected adult leaders, and the pain of my parents' divorce, which had become final the day before the retreat began. A pain I did everything in my power to deny and ignore, all coalesced into one profound moment of despair, in which I asked the question, "Okay, God, what do you want from me? Be my priest." 6 months later, I started my freshman year at a Catholic college seminary, knowing that I was there because I had been called. I gave up multiple music scholarships to various schools, figuring that following my calling was more important than doing what I wanted to do. I was there following an ideal, a fictitious notion of what it meant to be a priest, and I set standards for myself and for everyone around me we couldn't possibly live up to. I was miserable, of course, but I wouldn't dare let anyone know. After all, I was called. Not long after arriving at the seminary, I found myself in a leadership position for the school's music program. Perhaps you're not surprised by this, but I certainly was. It was in seminary that I first started singing, directing groups, and composing music for worship. All of this was new to me. In high school, I'd been a jazz trumpet player and an occasional heavy metal guitarist. But in church music, I found not only a passion, but a spiritual discipline, a means of connection with the source of life, the creative spirit. And this eventually led me to a difficult decision. Priest and church musician were, as best I could tell, mutually exclusive roles. How could I be what I was called to be and still do what I love? That's when I discovered St. Francis. I'd known about the Franciscans since I was a little boy. The chaplain on the Air Force Base where we lived until I was 6 years old was a Franciscan, and he's still a close family friend. He caused quite a stir when he arrived on base. Perhaps it had something to do with the sign he hung on his front porch that said, "Home for Unwed Fathers." Wait for it. There are many other stories, but suffice it to say that Father Guy was something of a radical, and we liked him a lot. He's the one I called when I was struggling with the question of how best to live out my calling. And it's because of him that I ended up contacting the Franciscans and going to see what they were all about. In the course of my first visit, I learned that as a Franciscan I could be a priest and a church musician. And I learned that these guys tended to live way out on the fringes of the church, serving the needs of the poor and the marginalized, without too much regard for the official doctrine or party line. I was sure that I had found the next step in following my calling. That's my mother with me at my novitiate. And yet, life as a Franciscan didn't seem to work out too well for me either. I enjoyed being a friar, and they certainly made it clear they were happy to have me among them. It could have had something to do with the fact that out of 350 men, I was the only one in my 20s. But I carried with me into the Franciscans the same tendencies I had in seminary: idealism and judgment. I didn't just want to be a good friar, I wanted to be St. Francis himself. And I expected everyone else to be him too. And of course, I was disappointed. Francis knew something about disappointment in his life. The son of a wealthy merchant in Assisi, Francis had joined the army as a young man, being captured and spending a year in a prison in Perugia. When he returned, something was very different about him. He no longer spoke of taking over the family business. Rather, he infuriated his father by giving away the bulk of his father's merchandise, all the while talking dreamily of the one he called Lady Poverty. It was service to her that would shape the course of Francis' life. She was the constant source of his calling. When Francis began to attract followers, he made sure that they knew poverty as their most important vow. He called them fratres minorum, or little brothers. They begged for their subsistence and slept wherever they could find a warm spot, usually in a field or a cave. Francis' interpretation of the vow of poverty was something radical. The monasteries which dotted the Italian landscape were places of enormous wealth, where property was held in common by the community. These monasteries controlled much of the agricultural and mercantile production throughout the region, and they become places of deep corruption. Francis forbade his brothers to have any property whatsoever. They didn't have monasteries or income. They lived simple lives of service and prayer, and they were happy. I know they were happy because I watched Franco Zeffirelli's film, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. Some of you may have seen it too. It came out in 1972 and had a really sappy score by Donovan. The movie portrays Francis as something of an uber hippie, and I know several people who went out and sold everything they had after watching it. It's powerful stuff, but not quite realistic. What the film leaves out is the latter part of Francis' life, when, as the order had grown larger and he had become quite ill as a result of the harsh treatment of his body, Francis turned over leadership to one of the other brothers. Even before his death, the friars had begun building friaries, homes for the brothers, and some had sought fame and fortune as preachers and scholars. Within a decade after his death, the order would have been largely unrecognizable to Francis. Disappointed? Yes, but not judgmental. Francis had a deep sense of his own calling, but he also had the wisdom to know that it wasn't everyone else's. In fact, as his death approached, Francis confided in his friend, Brother Leo, "I have done what was mine to do. May God now show you what is yours." I didn't understand Francis' words until long after I had left the order. I spent far too much time judging myself and my fellow friars for not being Francis, and not nearly enough time seeking to understand and follow my own calling. Now, of course, this whole calling thing got a bit complicated when I decided that I didn't believe in God anymore. My sense of call was very much tied up in the idea that God had asked me to be a priest. And all of that came into question once I started analyzing that experience of call from a psychological and sociological perspective. Of course I thought I was supposed to be a priest. That's the easy way to run from my experience of family and failed relationships. And once I became a friar, I was living high on the hog. I lived in a $2 million house in a hip Chicago neighborhood, and all my bills were paid. I had a professional chef cooking my meals, and I got to study and write music all the time. Poverty? Not so much. But it was awfully comfortable, and all I had to do was take what was being handed to me. The word vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. It's a much different word than occupation, which literally means something that takes up your time. I believe far too many people spend their lives in occupations rather than vocations, and that our communities and our relationships suffer because of it. I found that being a Franciscan had become my occupation. It was what I did when I wasn't making music. When I was playing or composing or singing, I was truly happy. And everything else was what I did between gigs. The problem was that being a Franciscan gave me the connections and financial stability I needed so I could spend the rest of my time making music without making any money at it. It's an interesting turn of events. A few years ago, my father visited me. He's a computer programmer who plays rock and roll in biker bars on the weekends. Seriously. Anyway, I was talking about how lucky I am now to be able to do what I love most for a living. And he responded by saying how much he hated his job, but that he needed it so that he could make enough money to do what he loved in his spare time. I realize now that's how I felt about being a Franciscan the year before I left. The decision to leave the friars was the most difficult choice I've ever made. I had gone from following my calling with all my heart to giving up on the possibility that such a calling was ever real to begin with. And when I left music behind too. From where I am now, this makes total sense. Music for me is about community. I don't make music for self-gain or so I can be a rock star. Rather, I make music as a natural response to being in religious community. For me, this space, our gathered community, is filled with song, and I just do what I can to listen and write it down. But between the day I left the friars and the day I started working at the church in Nashville, the music disappeared. And I thought it was gone forever. Thankfully, it did come back. in this place where we sing the wrong words to songs many of us know by heart, I found that it wasn't about the words at all. To say that the words are wrong or that they can only mean what they used to mean is to be trapped in literalism. Literal religion says that if you're called to be a priest, then by Jove, you'd better be a priest. Literal religion says that the way things are is the way they're supposed to be, and your job, your occupation, is to support the status quo. St. Francis appealed to me, as he does to so many others, precisely because he rejected this line of thinking. Francis was, without a doubt, a religious liberal. His one and only responsibility was to follow the call he felt in his heart. It didn't fit nicely within the existing institutions, nor did it win him friends among the wealthy and powerful. But he followed his calling nonetheless, and the world is better for it. Some say he brought about the end of the feudal system in Europe, or that he jump-started the Renaissance. I think what he did was live a brave and beautiful life. And for that, people all over the world, of every faith tradition, find in him inspiration to discover and live out their own calling. I think I'm a better Franciscan now than I was back then. Now that I'm not trying to be Francis anymore, I can follow his example more faithfully. Listening for that still small voice deep within, or sometimes the overwhelming bombastic song that cries out to be sung, I know that I am more attentive to my calling, my vocation, here with you, than I was when I wore that robe. And I see now that there were tremendous gifts given to me in those days. An experience and appreciation for good worship, a love for making music in community, a passion for justice, a concern for the poor and the marginalized. All of these gifts are deeply ingrained in me because of my experience as a friar, and they are the passions which call to me as I embrace the vocation I hear so clearly now. It was my friend Eric who first coined the term. We were classmates at Vanderbilt Divinity School when we were playing our regular Friday morning pickup basketball game. Eric was trying to get a handle on the whole Unitarian Universalist thing and how in the world I'd ended up there after being such an obviously committed Catholic. I told him how it really wasn't a difficult jump from Franciscan spirituality, especially the kind of panentheistic tendencies found in the Canticle of Brother Sun. After all, this was a guy who preached to birds and wolves when no one else would listen. A guy whose most profound spiritual insight was communicated through a song of praise of creation. I didn't think it much of a stretch to go from that to Unitarian Universalism. So Eric said, I guess that makes you a Franciscatarian, huh? Right away I knew he had nailed it. That's what I am, a Franciscatarian. Maybe a Franciscaversalist. Thankfully, the term I use doesn't really matter. What matters is that I see my self-understanding, my calling as a person of faith, is shaped by the example of St. Francis, Il Poverello, the little poor man of Assisi, whose life was a poetic madness, a perpetual intoxication with divine love. This is the lens through which I experience Unitarian Universalism, and how I'm able to be spiritually grounded in a multi-faith community such as ours. I know that in this community there are many stories, many lenses through which we view our liberal faith. And together we're going through a moment of transformation, a moment when it is vitally important that we be able to hear our call both individually and as a whole. Where are we headed and why? And whom shall we call to lead us? The work of hearing and heeding our common vocation is work that will challenge and change us all. I believe that naming our calling is the central task that lies before this community right now. It is the process by which we will come to know our soul as people of faith. And I'm heartened to know that so much good work is being done to help us discern that call. May we have the courage to explore uncharted territory in our journey together, guided by the light of Brother Sun and Sister Moon, urged on by the example of Francis and so many others like him, who exemplify what it means to be liberated from the bondage of worn-out patterns and broken models. May we have the courage to listen and to sing our own song. I'd like to close this morning with a prayer that Francis didn't write, but which nonetheless has become known as the Peace Prayer of St. Francis. The story is that the text was found in France near the end of World War I, written on the back of a prayer card with Francis' picture on the front. I think it's a poignant plea for clarity and understanding of our call, our vocation, and pretty much sums up what Francis was all about, even if he didn't write it. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is error, truth. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. May it be so, and amen.